The story of humanity is often presented as a straight line, a slow, steady climb from primitive beginnings to the complex world we inhabit today, a single, unbroken thread of progress. But what if that line is an illusion? What if beneath the familiar story lies another, a vast erased chapter of our own past, leaving behind only faint, impossible echoes in stone? Before we begin this investigation, a simple request. If you value this kind of exploration, a like on this video helps immensely. Subscribing ensures you don't miss where this path leads, and please, leave a comment telling us what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our global geography. Our journey starts not with a theory, but with a fact, a physical place. In southern Turkey there is a man-made hill known as Göbekli Tepe. For decades it was dismissed as little more than a medieval cemetery. But in the 1990s the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began to excavate. What he uncovered was not a graveyard, but what is now considered the world's oldest known temple complex, a series of massive circular structures built from pillars of limestone weighing many tons. These pillars, standing up to 6 meters tall, are carved with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, snakes, boars, and strange stylized human figures. This is a calm, analytical observation of a physical site. The arrangement of stones and the carvings are verifiable. The scale of the construction is measurable. There is nothing controversial here, until we ask a simple question. When was it built? According to repeated radiocarbon dating, the oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe were constructed around 9,600 BCE. That is 11,600 years ago. Let's place that number in context. The standard historical model, the one taught in schools, follows a clear linear progression. In simple terms, it suggests that the invention of agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago, was the great catalyst. Farming created food surpluses, which allowed nomadic hunter-gatherers to settle in permanent villages. These villages grew into towns, then cities. Only then, with a stable society and specialized labor, did humanity develop the capacity for things like monumental architecture and complex organized religion. And here, the timeline breaks. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were, by all archaeological evidence, hunter-gatherers. They were a people who, according to the linear model, should not have possessed the social structure, the specialized skills, or the collective motivation to quarry, transport, and erect dozens of multi-ton stone pillars. They built a cathedral in the Stone Age, thousands of years before the invention of pottery, writing, or the wheel. This isn't a small adjustment to the timeline, it's a fundamental contradiction. It suggests that the story of our ascent might not be a simple, straight line at all. The question is not just how they did it, but what this anomaly implies about the very beginning of our story. The site Klaus Schmidt began to uncover in southern Turkey isn't just another ruin. It's a clean chronological break. Göbekli Tepe forces a direct confrontation with the timeline we thought we knew. According to repeated radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at the site, its oldest layers were constructed around 9,600 BCE. That's approximately 11,600 years ago. To place this in context, this is more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge and 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It predates the invention of pottery, writing, and the wheel. This isn't a simple collection of huts. It is a complex of massive circular enclosures built around monolithic pillars of limestone. These are not rough, unworked stones. They are elegant T-shaped structures, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to an estimated 10 tons. Carved onto their surfaces with stunning artistry are high-relief images of animals, scorpions, foxes, lions, snakes, and vultures. These were not the docile creatures of a farming society. They are the predators and scavengers of a hunter's world, a world that, according to the standard model, should not have been capable of this level of organization, symbolism, and engineering. The accepted narrative of linear history is straightforward. First, humans developed agriculture, which created food surpluses. This allowed for settled villages, which grew into cities. Only then, with a stable population and specialized labor, did complex religion and monumental architecture emerge. Göbekli Tepe reverses this sequence entirely. Here it seems hunter-gatherers first came together to build a cathedral on a hill, and the effort required to feed this large coordinated workforce may have been the very thing that spurred the invention of agriculture nearby. The temple came before the town, but the most unsettling detail is not how it was built, but how it was abandoned. Around the 8th millennium BCE, after more than 1,000 years of use, the entire site was deliberately and meticulously buried. Its creators backfilled the massive enclosures with dirt, stone, and animal bones, entombing their own creation under a man-made hill. It was not destroyed or left to decay. It was preserved. Why would a culture invest generations of effort into a sacred site, only to carefully bury it for reasons we cannot yet fathom? This act of deliberate burial preserved the site in near-perfect condition, but it deepens the central inconsistency. Some researchers propose that the site functioned as a sophisticated astronomical observatory. It is argued that one particular pillar, known as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, may even be a timestamp, a celestial map depicting a catastrophic comet impact that triggered the Younger Dryas climate event, an idea put forward by authors like Andrew Collins. We check this claim. While the carvings are suggestive, this interpretation remains a hypothesis, not a confirmed fact. What remains is the stone itself, a megalithic complex of immense sophistication, built by people who, by all rights, should have been living simple, nomadic lives. If a structure like this could exist so early in Anatolia, it raises a fundamental question. Is Göbekli Tepe a complete anomaly, a one-time flash of inexplicable genius? Or is it simply the first of its kind that we have happened to find, a surviving whisper from a chapter of human history that has been almost entirely erased? This forces us to look again at other monuments, ones we thought we understood. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe is a profound act of preservation, a message sealed for a future time. But if one such chronological anomaly exists, it forces a question. Are there others? Are there clues to this lost chapter hidden in plain sight, embedded within monuments so familiar we've stopped seeing them at all? This question takes us from the hills of Turkey to the desert plateau of Giza in Egypt, to the foot of perhaps the most enigmatic statue on Earth, the Great Sphinx. Carved from a single mass of bedrock, it gazes east with a silence that seems to absorb the noise of millennia. For generations, the consensus view of mainstream Egyptology has been clear and unwavering. The Sphinx is attributed to the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafre, who reigned around 2500 BCE. The reasoning is largely contextual. The statue is part of the Giza pyramid complex, which includes Khafre's pyramid, and its face is said to bear a resemblance to other known statues of him. It's a neat, tidy explanation that places the monument squarely within the known timeline of dynastic Egypt. But in 1990, a geologist from Boston University named Robert Schoch was asked to examine the monument, not as a work of art or a historical artifact, but as a piece of rock. He was not an Egyptologist and had no stake in its accepted history. He was there to read the story told by the stone itself. What he observed was a deep and unsettling inconsistency. The weathering patterns on the body of the Sphinx and, more importantly, on the walls of the limestone enclosure from which it was carved did not look like the product of wind and sand. This is where the story diverges. The official explanation attributes the monument's erosion to the harsh desert environment, thousands of years of wind-blown sand acting like a slow-motion sandblaster. This process typically creates a distinct pattern of horizontal layered weathering, as the wind scours the softer rock layers more than the harder ones. This type of erosion is visible on many other structures on the Giza plateau from the same period. Robert Schoch's analysis, first presented to the Geological Society of America in 1991, pointed to a completely different agent. The deep vertical fissures and rounded undulating profiles on the Sphinx's enclosure walls were, in his expert view, classic examples of precipitation-induced weathering. In simple terms, this is the kind of erosion caused by large amounts of rainfall running down the surface of the rock for a very, very long time. It is not the signature of a desert. This conclusion creates a stark chronological problem. The climate on the Giza Plateau has been arid and hyper-arid for the last 5,000 years, just like it is today. To find a period with enough sustained rainfall to carve the bedrock in this way, one has to go back much further in time, to the period before 5000 BCE, at the end of the last ice age. If the geological evidence is correct, then the Sphinx was carved not in the desert we know, but in a greener, wetter environment. It would mean the monument is thousands of years older than the pharaoh Khafra, older than the pyramids, and older, in fact, than dynastic Egypt itself. The claim of water erosion on the Sphinx, first systemically argued by geologist Robert Schoch in the early 1990s, is not a matter of complex interpretation. It is a direct observation of the stone itself. The argument rests on a simple, visible distinction between two different ways rock can weather over immense periods of time. The question is, what does the stone actually show us? In simple terms, erosion by wind and sand works like a sand blaster. It is most aggressive near the ground, where the wind can carry the most abrasive particles. Over thousands of years, this process scours away the lower portions of a rock face, creating horizontal channels and undercuts. Erosion by rainfall, however, works from the top down. Water running down a stone surface for centuries carves deep vertical fissures and rounded rolling profiles, much like water flowing over a landscape. This distinction is the entire core of the geological case. The body of the Sphinx, and particularly the walls of the enclosure from which it was carved, display the classic signatures of prolonged, heavy rainfall, the deep vertical fissures. In contrast, other structures on the Giza plateau, which are undisputedly dated to the pharaoh Khafra around 2500 BCE, show the horizontal, wind-scoured patterns typical of a desert environment. When we compare them side by side, the weathering patterns appear to belong to two entirely different climatic eras. This is where the argument moves from a simple observation to a check against the climate record. Mainstream science confirms that the Sahara was not always a desert. For several thousand years, ending sometime before 5000 BCE, the region experienced a period of much higher rainfall known as the African Humid Period. It was a savanna, green and wet. For the Sphinx to have acquired its deep rain-weathering marks, the hypothesis suggests it must have stood exposed to that climate for a very long time, long before the accepted age of Khafra's reign, when the desert was already firmly established. So we are left with a quiet paradox. The historical record, based on context and style, places the monument in one time period. The geological evidence, based on climate science, and the physical weathering of the limestone, points to another, far older one. The stones of the Giza plateau seem to tell one story, and the history books another. This suggests that perhaps the most important clues to our past are not always where we expect them to be. What if other evidence lies hidden, not in the sands of the desert, but under the silence of the waves? If the geological story of the Giza plateau is written in sand and limestone, our search for other erased chapters must now go deeper. The land holds many secrets. But the greatest archive of lost time may not be buried under sand at all. It may be submerged beneath the sea. After the last great ice age melted from approximately 20,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by an estimated 120 metres. That's nearly 400 feet. Entire coastlines, islands, and perhaps even cities from that remote period were slowly, relentlessly drowned. This brings our investigation to the waters off the coast of Japan. In the year 1986, a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake was scouting a new location near the island of Yonaguni. What he reported finding, resting 82 feet below the surface, was a colossal submerged stone structure. It appeared to be a kind of ziggurat, a massive terraced monument with broad, flat platforms, enormous steps, and what looked like sheer walls meeting at sharp 90-degree angles. This structure, now known as the Yonaguni Monument, immediately created a deep and unresolved inconsistency. One group of researchers, most notably Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, has argued for over 2 decades that the monument is artificial. After extensive dives and mapping, his team claims to have identified features that are difficult to explain through natural processes alone, including what they interpret as a turtle-like carving and pathways that encircle the main structure. The sheer geometry of the site, they argue, points to a monolith carved in place by human hands. However, there is a strong and compelling counter-argument. Mainstream geologists, including Robert Schoch, who proposed the water erosion on the Sphinx, remain unconvinced. They point out that the monument is composed of sandstone, a type of rock that naturally fractures along straight planes, often creating features that look uncannily artificial. According to this view, the steps, terraces, and right angles are the result of predictable geological processes and tectonic activity common in the region. It is a natural formation, a lusus naturae, a joke of nature. Here the logic is inescapable. If the structure is even partially man-made, it could only have been built when it was above sea level. Given the rate of sea level rise in this region, this would push its construction back to at least 10,000 years ago, placing it squarely in the same mysterious epoch as Göbekli Tepe and the proposed older Sphinx. The object itself presents a perfect fork in the path. It is either an extraordinary example of natural geology, or it is one of the oldest and most enigmatic underwater ruins on the planet. And so the pattern expands. We have anomalies on land, carved into limestone bedrock, and buried under millennia of earth. And now we have a potential anomaly submerged beneath the waves, its story dissolved by time and salt water. All of these clues seem to point toward the same remote period, a time before recorded history. This raises a crucial question. Could a single, global event connect them all? The anomalies we have examined so far, a sophisticated temple built by hunter-gatherers, a monument weathered by rain in a desert, and a possible city submerged by the sea, are geographically isolated. They are separated by thousands of miles, and, according to standard models, by thousands of years. On their own, each is a fascinating local puzzle, but taken together, they suggest a different kind of question. What if they are not isolated puzzles at all? What if they are the scattered aftermath of a single global event? If such an event occurred, it would have to be of a scale capable of altering the entire planet. It would have to be a cataclysm. To check for such a thing, we must leave the domain of archaeology for a moment and turn to the raw, physical record of the Earth itself, the story told by ice cores, ocean sediments, and the fossil record. And that record tells us something very clearly. The end of the last ice age was not a smooth, gradual thaw. It was a period of violent climatic instability. After thousands of years of slow warming, just as the world was emerging from the deep freeze, something happened that plunged it right back in. This event has a name, the Younger Dryas. According to geological and ice core data, it began abruptly around 12,800 years ago. In a geological blink of an eye, average temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted, in some regions by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. It was a sudden, brutal return to near full glacial conditions that lasted for approximately 1,200 years, before ending just as suddenly around 11,600 years ago. This wasn't a regional cold snap. It was a planetary shock to the system. What could cause such a violent and sudden climate reversal? For a long time, the mechanism was a mystery, with theories ranging from shifts in ocean currents to volcanic activity. But in recent decades, a powerful and unsettling hypothesis has gained significant traction. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. In simple terms, this hypothesis proposes that the cataclysm was triggered by the airbursts and impacts of multiple fragments from a disintegrating giant comet. According to proponents of this theory, these fragments struck the North American ice sheet and other parts of the world, triggering continent-spanning wildfires and injecting enormous volumes of dust and water vapor into the atmosphere, which blocked out the sun and initiated the sudden deep freeze. It is important to state that this impact hypothesis is still the subject of vigorous scientific debate. Evidence for it includes the discovery of a black mat layer across North America, dating precisely to the event, containing nanodiamonds, microscopic spherules of melted rock, and high concentrations of platinum, all considered potential markers of an extraterrestrial impact. While the evidence is compelling to many, it is not yet universally accepted, and alternative explanations for the climate shift still exist. But for the purpose of our investigation, the specific cause is secondary to the effect. The scientific consensus is clear on one point. 12,800 years ago, our planet was struck by a cataclysm of almost unimaginable proportions. A world-altering event is not a matter of speculation. It is written into the geological record. The question that follows is a logical one. What did this event do, not just to the climate and the megafauna, but to the people who lived through it? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes a trigger, a moment of cosmic violence. But the real story is written not in the sky, but in the layers of the Earth itself. The consequences of this event, whether from an impact or another cause, were not subtle. They were absolute. Across North America and in sites around the world, archaeologists find a stark boundary line in the soil, dating to roughly 12,800 years ago. It's a thin, dark layer known as the black mat. This layer is not just dirt. According to analysis published in journals like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it is rich in carbon, soot, and other markers of continent-spanning wildfires. Within this boundary, researchers have also reported finding nanodiamonds and microscopic metallic spherules, materials consistent with the extreme temperatures and pressures of an extraterrestrial impact. This black mat is a geological tombstone marking the end of an entire world. Below this line lies the Pleistocene, an epoch teeming with giants, woolly mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and giant ground sloths. Above it, they are gone. The extinction event at the onset of the Younger Dryas was brutally efficient. In North America alone, an estimated 35 genera of large mammals vanished. That's not 35 species, but entire categories of animal life, erased from the planet in a geological instant. The precise mechanism for this extinction remains a subject of intense academic debate. The three leading hypotheses are overhunting by humans, climate change, or the impact event. What is not in dispute, however, is the timing. The disappearance of the megafauna aligns sharply with the beginning of the Younger Dryas and the appearance of the black mat layer. It marks a profound biological regime change, one of the most significant in the last several million years. And it wasn't just the animals. A human culture also disappears at this boundary. For centuries, the Clovis people had flourished across North America, their distinctive fluted spear points found from coast to coast. They were successful, adaptable hunters of the great beasts, but at the black mat layer their story abruptly ends. Their artifacts, so common below the line, are almost entirely absent above it. They vanish from the archaeological record. But the Younger Dryas was a two-act catastrophe. After the initial shock of fire and cold came the final act, water. The 1,300-year cold snap ended as quickly as it began. As the planet rapidly warmed, the vast ice sheets that still covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt at an unprecedented rate. According to geological estimates, this led to a series of catastrophic meltwater pulses, causing global sea levels to rise dramatically. Some models suggest a rise of as much as 120 meters, or nearly 400 feet from the peak of the Ice Age to the stable levels of our own time, drowning coastlines and continental shelves around the entire planet. Imagine a world first scoured by fire, then plunged into a deep freeze, a world where the great beasts die off and human cultures collapse, and then a world where the oceans themselves rise to swallow the coastlines, a planetary reset button. If such a world was lost beneath the waves, what would happen to its stories? What would become of the memory of the flood? The physical evidence for the Younger Dryas catastrophe is written in layers of ice and sediment. It's a story told by geology of a world violently reset. But if such an event truly happened, if it erased entire landscapes and populations, it must have left another kind of trace. A scar not on the earth, but in the memory of those who survived. Without written language to record data, how does a species preserve the memory of an apocalypse? It tells a story. And here, when we check the oldest stories of humanity, a stunning pattern emerges. From every corner of the ancient world, from cultures separated by vast oceans and millennia of time, we hear a strangely familiar tale. The story of a great flood. This is not a single isolated myth. According to researchers in the field of comparative mythology, it is a narrative archetype, a recurring blueprint found in hundreds of cultures, many of whom had no conceivable contact with one another. We see it in Mesopotamia, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero Utnapishtim is warned by a god to build a great boat to survive a deluge sent to wipe out mankind. In ancient India, the sage Manu is warned of the coming flood by a fish and builds a ship to save himself. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha are the sole survivors of a flood sent by Zeus, having been warned to build a chest to float in. And of course, there is the Hebrew account of Noah, tasked with building an ark to preserve life on earth. This is the calm, analytical surface of the problem. When we compare these narratives, the similarities go far beyond the simple fact of a flood. The structure of the story is often identical. First, a divine warning is given to a chosen hero. Second, specific instructions are provided to build a vessel of survival. Third, this vessel carries a small group of humans and often pairs of animals. Fourth, the world is destroyed by water. Fifth, the vessel eventually comes to rest on a mountaintop, and finally, the survivors are tasked with repopulating the Earth. The question is unavoidable. Are these hundreds of stories merely a coincidence? Are they all independent inventions born from local river floods that were later exaggerated into global events? Perhaps. But the consistency of the narrative architecture, the specific sequence of warning, vessel, survival and rebirth, is deeply unsettling. It feels less like a coincidence and more like the distinct, echoing memory of a single, worldwide event filtered through the lens of 1,000 different cultures. This recurring global narrative of a world-ending flood is not a minor coincidence. It is one of the most stable and persistent themes in the entire library of human mythology. The pattern is too specific, too widespread, and too consistent to be dismissed as a simple collection of local flood stories. The details change, an ark, a canoe, a mountaintop, but the core signal remains the same, a cataclysm from the sky, overwhelming waters, and a handful of survivors who preserve the seeds of life and knowledge. So we are faced with a stark inconsistency. On one hand, we have a scientifically verified global trauma, the Younger Dryas, a period of violent climate shifts, melting ice caps, and a catastrophic rise in sea level that peaked roughly between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. On the other hand, we have a global memory of that exact event, preserved in the stories of hundreds of cultures. What if these are not two separate phenomena? This leads us to the central hypothesis of our investigation. The proposal is this: the Great Flood myths are not fiction. They are a form of memory. They are the fragmented, allegorical, and deeply traumatized accounts of the survivors of the Younger Dryas cataclysm, passed down through countless generations. In this view, mythology becomes a vehicle for transmitting a warning and a history across an immense gulf of time, a period far too long for written records to survive. To be clear, this does not mean that a man named Noah literally built a wooden boat to house every animal species. The mechanism for this kind of long-term memory is allegory. Pre-literate societies encode vital information into memorable stories. The narrative is the hard drive. The characters, the gods, and the monsters are the file names. The details of the story might get embellished, localized, or reinterpreted over time, but the essential data, the warning of a world-destroying flood that came from the sky and the sea, is preserved with stunning fidelity. The myths are the message in a bottle. If this hypothesis is correct, it fundamentally changes what we are looking at. We're no longer dealing with simple campfire stories or religious allegories. We are potentially looking at a highly sophisticated, time-tested method of data transmission from a lost human past. The Younger Dryas is no longer just a geological event. It becomes the defining trauma that shaped the consciousness of our species, an event so profound that we are still telling stories about it 12,000 years later. The myths are the echoes of their voices. We have arrived at a point where geology and mythology seem to tell the same story, a story of a global catastrophe, echoing through the ages as a persistent shared memory. It's a profound idea that the entire human family might be bound by the faint recollection of a single, world-altering event. And before we follow this thread deeper, a brief pause. If this investigation resonates with you, your support through a like on this video is a genuine contribution to keeping these questions open. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next steps. And, as we are speaking of a global story, let us know in the comments, what time is it where you are watching from? It is always fascinating to see the map of our shared curiosity. Now, let's continue. If the memory of the disaster survived in allegory, could something more tangible have survived as well? Could fragments of a lost science, of astronomy, engineering and mathematics have also been passed down, encoded not in words but in stone? To check this, we must look again at the most ancient and imposing structures on Earth. If the memory of a global cataclysm can be preserved in myth, could it also be encoded in stone? Could the most famous monuments on Earth be more than just tombs and temples? What if they are also messages designed to carry a specific piece of information across immense spans of time? This line of inquiry brings us back to the Giza plateau, not to its geology but to its geometry. The three Great Pyramids stand as a familiar, almost primal image of ancient Egypt. The standard explanation holds that they are tombs, built for three pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BCE. But in the early 1990s, a Belgian engineer named Robert Bouval proposed a radical new observation. He argued that the layout of the three pyramids on the ground was not an accident of geography or dynastic planning. It was a precise map of the sky. This hypothesis, now known as the Orion correlation theory, points to an uncanny resemblance. The arrangement of the two larger pyramids, Khufu and Khafre, and the smaller, slightly offset pyramid of Menkaure, appears to be a direct terrestrial mirror of the three stars that form Orion's belt. The size of the pyramids even seems to correspond to the brightness of the stars. It's an elegant and visually compelling idea, but it immediately creates a problem. The alignment is not perfect in our time, nor was it perfect in the supposed age of the pharaohs. So what does it actually point to? To answer that, we need to understand a slow, majestic, and deeply important celestial mechanism, the precession of the equinoxes. In simple terms, the Earth is not a perfectly stable spinning top. As it rotates, it has a very slow, subtle wobble on its axis. This wobble completes one full cycle roughly every 25,920 years. What this actually means for us on the ground is that the positions of the stars in the night sky appear to drift over millennia. It's a great celestial clock, ticking at a pace almost too slow for a single human lifetime to notice, but which fundamentally changes the view of the cosmos over the ages. This is the key to the Orion correlation theory. Using modern astronomical software, one can wind back this celestial clock and see how the stars looked from Giza in any given epoch. According to the calculations of Bouval, and later expanded upon by author Graham Hancock, there is one specific time when the alignment between the pyramids on the ground and the stars of Orion's belt in the sky reaches its most perfect match. That moment is estimated to be around 10,500 BCE. This date, 10,500 BCE, is statistically uncomfortable. It lands directly within the same mysterious epoch suggested by the water erosion on the Sphinx and the dawn of construction at Göbekli Tepe. It points squarely back to the era of the Younger Dryas cataclysm. This does not necessarily mean the pyramids were physically built at that time. Rather, the hypothesis suggests that the architectural plan itself is a message. It could be a blueprint passed down through generations, or a deliberate astronomical statement by its builders, whoever they were, to mark that specific ancient __quote_3__. In this view, the Giza Plateau is not merely a graveyard for kings. It is an immense, silent clock, with its hands frozen, pointing to a single, transformative moment deep in the lost memory of the world. The astronomical alignment of the Giza pyramids suggests a design locked to a specific ancient epoch, but the why of their placement is only half of the puzzle. The other half is the how, and when we move from the celestial map to the engineering blueprint, the mystery only deepens. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is not just a pile of stones, it is a work of staggering, almost obsessive precision. Let's begin with its orientation. A modern, high-precision structure like the Meridian Building at the Greenwich Observatory in London is reportedly aligned to true north with an error of 9/60ths of a degree. According to multiple modern surveys, including those by the archaeologist Flinders Petrie, the Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an error of just 3/60ths of a degree. This means it is more accurately aligned than a modern observatory, a feat achieved supposedly without telescopes, compasses, or satellite positioning. This level of accuracy demands a sophisticated understanding of geodesy and astronomy. To be fair, the skill of the dynastic Egyptians should not be underestimated. Their achievements in quarrying, transport, and organization are well documented. The question is not one of manpower, but of the specific knowledge and tools required for this particular kind of precision on such a colossal scale. Acknowledging their ingenuity does not resolve the inconsistency, it sharpens it. The problem escalates when we examine the construction itself. The pyramid is comprised of an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, most weighing several tons. Originally it was covered in highly polished white Tura limestone casing stones. According to Petrie's 19th century measurements, these stones were cut and fitted with joints often no wider than 1/50th of an inch. Some of the internal granite coffer stones are cut from single pieces of hard stone with a precision that modern stonemasons have admitted would be a challenge to replicate today, even with laser-guided equipment. And then there are the mathematical properties. a more controversial but persistent layer of the anomaly. It is often claimed by researchers like John Taylor in the 19th century that the pyramid's geometry intentionally encodes fundamental constants. For example, the ratio of its original height to the perimeter of its base is said to closely approximate the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference, a value known as pi. Furthermore, some analyses suggest the proportions of the king's chamber and other features incorporate the golden ratio phi. While these claims are debated and could be coincidental, they add another layer of complexity to a structure that already defies simple explanation. The engineering challenges at Giza are immense, but they are not unique. Halfway across the world, in the mountains of South America, we find another site that seems to speak the same impossible language of stone. The precision of the Great Pyramid presents a profound engineering puzzle. It implies a mastery of geometry, logistics, and stone cutting that seems out of place in the accepted timeline of the Bronze Age. But the anomalies are not confined to Egypt. If we are truly following the scattered fingerprints of a lost chapter in human history, then the trail must be global. And so it is. Our investigation now moves half a world away, and nearly 4,000 meters, or 13,000 feet, up into the thin, cold air of the Bolivian Altiplano. Here, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, lies the sprawling ancient complex of Tiwanaku, and within it, a separate, more ancient, and far more baffling ruin known as Puma Punku. The name means the door of the puma. What remains today is a field of scattered, shattered, and impossibly crafted stone blocks. This is not a mystery of scale, like the Great Pyramid. It is a mystery of precision. The stones of Puma Punku are primarily made of red sandstone and andesite. The sandstone is local and relatively workable, but the andesite is a different matter entirely. Andesite is an extremely hard volcanic rock, with a hardness rating on the Mohs scale that is close to that of granite. In practical terms, this means that shaping it with the known tools of the Tiwanaku culture, stone hammers, and perhaps low-grade copper or bronze chisels, is a task of almost unimaginable difficulty. Yet, when we examine the andesite blocks at Puma Punku, particularly the famous H blocks, the word difficult seems inadequate. The stones appear to have been manufactured. They feature perfectly flat faces, true 90-degree interior and exterior corners, and complex interlocking shapes that fit together like pieces of a giant, intricate puzzle. Some blocks have rows of small, evenly spaced holes drilled into them, or smooth, narrow grooves cut with a uniformity that defies any explanation involving hand tools. To be clear, these are not near-perfect angles or almost flat surfaces. Independent engineering analyses have measured surfaces that are true to within fractions of a millimetre. The cuts are so straight and the corners so sharp that it has led many observers, including engineers and stonemasons, to hypothesize the use of some form of advanced machining. The stone itself seems to tell a story of saws, drills, and precision grinders. The problem, of course, is that according to the standard historical model, no such technology existed here. The conventional archaeological explanation assigns Puma Punku to the Tiwanaku Empire, dating it to sometime after 500 AD. But this explanation offers no workable mechanism for how these results were achieved. It simply states that they were. This leaves us with a fundamental inconsistency. The material evidence of the stones themselves appears to be in direct conflict with the technological capacity of their supposed builders. The mystery of Puma Punku is not just who built it, or when, but how. The stones of Puma Punku are not silent. They don't speak of kings or battles. They speak of a different kind of mystery, an engineering one. The problem is not just that the H blocks are heavy and intricately shaped. The true anomaly is the quality of the finish. The surfaces are perfectly flat. The interior corners are sharp and precise, with no sign of the slight imprecision that comes from hand tools. These are characteristics we associate not with ancient stonemasonry, but with modern machine tooling. To appreciate the scale of this problem, we must return to the material itself, andesite. On the Mohs scale of mineral hardness, where diamond is a 10 and steel is around a 6.5, andesite registers a solid 7. In simple terms, this means that to effectively cut or shape it, you need a tool that is significantly harder. The known tools of the Tiwanaku culture, bronze chisels and stone hammers, are simply not up to the task of producing these results. It would be like trying to carve a granite countertop with a copper butter knife. You might scratch the surface, but you would never achieve the clean, precise lines we see at Puma Punku. This leaves us with an uncomfortable but necessary question. If the known tools of the period could not have created these artifacts, then what did? The evidence on the stone itself seems to demand a technology that is completely absent from the archaeological record of the region. To explain the perfectly drilled holes, some engineers have hypothesized the use of something akin to high-speed rotary tools with hardened bits. To explain the razor-thin grooves and sharp internal angles, others suggest the possibility of sonic drilling or even high-pressure water jets mixed with an abrasive. To be perfectly clear, this is not evidence. This is a reverse engineering of the problem. It is an attempt to answer the question, what category of tool would we need today to replicate these features? And the answer consistently points towards a level of industrial technology. This is where the narrative often takes a predictable turn towards extraterrestrial intervention. But that is an easy answer that explains very little. It is an admission of defeat, a surrender of the human story. There is a more grounded and perhaps more profound hypothesis to consider. What if this technology wasn't alien but simply ancient? What if it wasn't brought from the stars but was instead the high water mark of a lost terrestrial civilization, a human one? In this model, the builders of Tiwanaku were not the inventors of this technology. They were its inheritors. Perhaps they were the distant descendants of a much older culture, preserving a fragment of a forgotten science. Or perhaps they simply found these impossible blocks scattered on the high plain, the enigmatic ruins of a world that had vanished long before their own time, and built their sacred site around a miracle they could not explain. The technology wasn't lost to them. It was never theirs to begin with. It was a legacy. The engineering riddles left in the high Andes are profound. But the trail of these megalithic fingerprints does not end there. It leads us across the Atlantic to the Bekaa Valley of modern-day Lebanon, to a site known as Baalbek. Here, the Roman Empire erected one of its most colossal and ornate temple complexes, dedicated to their god Jupiter. For centuries, this was the accepted story. Baalbek was a masterpiece of Roman ambition. But this story has a critical omission. The Romans built their temple on top of something else, a foundation, a podium, so enormous that it dwarfs their own celebrated engineering. The true mystery of Baalbek lies not in what the Romans built, but in what they found. The western retaining wall of this ancient podium contains a line of 3 monolithic limestone blocks that have no parallel in the known Roman world. They are called the trilithon. Here, the question is not one of subtle, interlocking precision, but of almost unimaginable scale and weight. According to engineering estimates, each of these 3 stones weighs in excess of 800 tons. 800 tons. To give that number a physical meaning, the main battle tank of a modern army weighs about 60 tons. One of these blocks is the weight of more than 13 such tanks, carved from a single piece of rock. They were quarried, moved over a significant distance, and then lifted more than 20 feet, or 6 meters, into the air to be fitted seamlessly into a wall. This presents a straightforward mechanical problem. There are no Roman records, no reliefs, no contemporary accounts that describe a technology capable of maneuvering objects of this specific mass. Their own impressive engineering, from aqueducts to the Colosseum, operated on a completely different scale of block size. The historical record is simply silent on how one would even begin to approach such a task, with the tools available at the time, and as if to deliberately underscore the point, the puzzle becomes even heavier. In a nearby quarry, less than a kilometre away, lies an even larger stone. It is known as the Hajar al-Hibla, or the Stone of the South. It is an unfinished monolith, still attached at its base to the bedrock. Its weight is estimated at over 1,200 tons. It is the largest known hewn stone from Antiquity. This single, abandoned block is perhaps the most important clue. It proves the intention. It confirms that whoever began this project was not experimenting. They were working to a plan that considered moving 1,200-ton objects to be a standard operational procedure. The Romans revered this platform enough to build their most sacred temple upon it. But they did not build the platform itself. From the Giza Plateau to the Bolivian Altiplano, and now to the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. These are not isolated puzzles. They appear to be pieces of a single, worldwide picture. The next step in our investigation is to see what that picture might look like when we begin to assemble the fragments. We have walked the desert sands of Giza, tracing the lines of impossible precision. We have stood in the thin air of the high Andes, faced with the machined surfaces of Puma Punku. We have travelled to the Bakar Valley, to the feet of megaliths at Baalbek that would challenge our own modern cranes. Each site, on its own, is a profound historical enigma, a deep question mark carved into the bedrock of our past. The standard historical model treats these as separate questions. It studies them in isolation, attributing them to distinct cultures, separated by vast oceans and in some cases thousands of years. This is the calm, analytical surface of archaeology. The Egyptians, the pre-Incan peoples of Tiwanaku, the builders before the Romans, each is given its own chapter, its own timeline, its own presumed set of tools and limitations. But when we step back, a different pattern begins to emerge, an uncomfortable one. The engineering problems solved at these sites are not just similar, they share a distinct signature. It's a fingerprint repeated in stone across the globe. First, there is the obsession with megalithic construction, the consistent choice to work with stone blocks weighing not just tens but hundreds, and in the case of Baalbek, over 1,000 tons. Second, there is the persistent and precise alignment to celestial bodies, locking these structures to the stars with an accuracy that implies long-term, sophisticated observation. And third, there is the geodesic intelligence, the near-perfect orientation to the cardinal directions, a knowledge of the planet's true dimensions. Here, the logical inconsistency becomes unavoidable. How did so many unconnected, supposedly Bronze Age or Stone Age cultures independently arrive at the same highly advanced and unique architectural solutions? Why this shared obsession with moving impossibly large stones and aligning them to the heavens with watchmaker precision? The official narrative of separate parallel development begins to strain under the weight of these coincidences. It asks us to believe that lightning struck in the same way, in the same style, in a dozen different places, without any connection. This forces us to consider a different hypothesis. What if these sites are not the independent inventions of separate cultures? What if, instead, they are the scattered legacy of a single, common source, a predecessor culture, a civilization that existed much earlier than our histories admit, a culture that had already developed a sophisticated understanding of engineering, astronomy, and geodesy, and whose knowledge was inherited imperfectly by the later cultures we know by name. To be perfectly clear, this hypothesis does not suggest a global empire with a shared flag and a common language. The archaeological record shows no such thing. What we are examining is the possibility of a shared technological and scientific inheritance, an echo of a lost body of knowledge which manifested differently in Egypt, in the Andes, and in the Levant, but which came from the same forgotten wellspring. It suggests we are not looking at the dawn of high culture, but at the twilight, the faint scattered remnants of a system of knowledge that was already ancient when the first pharaohs ruled. The question then is no longer just how these monuments were built, but who were the original architects of this global legacy, and what became of them? The trail of evidence we have followed is perplexing. We have a shared architectural signature, a fingerprint of advanced astronomical and engineering knowledge left in stone across the globe: Giza, Puma Punku, Baalbek. This signature strongly suggests a common source, a predecessor culture with a sophisticated understanding of the planet. But this raises the most difficult question of all. If such a culture existed, who were they? Where are their records, their texts, their names? The orthodox answer is simple: there are none, because they never existed. But there is another possibility. What if the records do exist, but we have been reading them incorrectly for centuries? What if the memory of these predecessors has been preserved not in libraries of stone, but in the library of myth? This is where our investigation takes a critical turn. It requires us to temporarily suspend our modern definitions and consider a radical hypothesis. What if the quote 4 of Antiquity were not gods at all? What if they were not supernatural beings from other dimensions, but something far more grounded and perhaps more astonishing, the human survivors of that lost civilization? Men and women possessed of advanced knowledge, remembered by the primitive, traumatized cultures they encountered as divine figures, a distorted memory of real historical events. Let us check this hypothesis against the myths themselves. In ancient Egypt, the legends speak of a remote golden age, Zep Tepi. The __quote, _5__ when gods walk the earth. Among them was Thoth, the ibis-headed deity credited with inventing writing, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. According to the texts, he was a civilizer, bringing order and knowledge to humanity after a chaotic period of destruction. Now we move across the Atlantic to ancient Mesoamerica. Here the myths speak of a tall, pale-skinned, bearded god known as Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Maya. The stories are remarkably consistent. He arrived from the east, by sea, after a great flood had devastated the world. He taught the people agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, and the art of peaceful government. After his time was done, he sailed away, promising one day to return. And from Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization itself, we have the account of the Babylonian priest Berossus. He writes of a strange being named Oannes, who emerged from the Persian Gulf in the earliest days of their history. Oannes was described as amphibious, spending his days among the primitive local population to teach them writing, architecture, geometry, and agriculture. Berossus is explicit. Before the arrival of Oannes, the people of Mesopotamia lived __6__. These stories are separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Yet, the core narrative template is uncannily similar. The pattern is not just _7, it is a very specific kind of figure, a civilizing hero. This being arrives, often from the sea, in the aftermath of a global catastrophe. It finds humanity in a primitive, scattered state. It then patiently teaches them the fundamental arts and sciences required to rebuild civilization before departing. This is not a description of a random mythological event. It is a description that sounds very much like a transfer of knowledge, a restart. When we examine the myths of these civilizing heroes, we find they are not remembered as conquerors or kings demanding tribute. They are remembered as teachers. Their arrival marks not the beginning of a new religion based on fear, but the start of a curriculum designed for recovery. The core question, then, is not just who they were, but what precisely they taught. The pattern begins with one of the oldest accounts from ancient Mesopotamia, as recorded by the Babylonian priest Berossus in the 3rd century BCE. He describes a being named Oannes who emerged from the Erythraean Sea. Oannes was said to be amphibious, spending his days among the people and his nights in the sea. Critically, Berossus writes that this being, quote, gave them an insight into letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and in short, instructed them in everything that could tend to soften manners and humanize their lives. This is a remarkably specific description. It is not the story of a slow trial and error discovery of civilization. It is a story of direct knowledge transfer. According to the account, Oannes didn't guide humanity to invent these things. He delivered a complete package, writing for record-keeping, architecture for shelter, laws for social structure. The myth is quite clear. Before his arrival, humanity lived without rule, like beasts of the field. After his departure, nothing new needed to be invented. The foundations had been laid. This same theme, a sudden impartation of foundational knowledge, echoes across the globe. In ancient Egypt, the god Thoth was revered as the divine scribe, the one who gave humanity the gift of hieroglyphic writing, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. His knowledge was not a suggestion. It was the bedrock of Egyptian civilization itself. Then we cross the Atlantic to ancient Mesoamerica. Here, the feathered serpent god, known as Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Maya, arrives to teach the arts of agriculture, the science of the calendar, and the skills of metallurgy and building. When we compare these accounts, a clear functional pattern emerges. The gifts brought by these mysterious figures are not random miracles. They form a specific and pragmatic toolkit for rebuilding a society from the ground up. First, agriculture, the ability to secure a stable food supply. Second, law and social order, the framework for people to live together. Third, writing and mathematics, the software for preserving and transmitting complex information. And fourth, astronomy, the knowledge of celestial cycles for timekeeping, navigation, and planting. This is not a list of divine party tricks. It is a survival kit for a species that has been knocked back to zero. We have followed 3 distinct trails of evidence. The first is written in stone. globally scattered megalithic sites exhibiting a shared fingerprint of impossible engineering and astronomical precision. The second is written in the Earth's geological record, the clear signature of a world-ending cataclysm around 12,800 years ago. And the third is written in myth, the persistent worldwide memory of civilizing heroes who arrived after a great flood to give humanity the tools for a new beginning. This leads to a working hypothesis that is both radical and strangely simple. What if these are not three separate stories, but three parts of a single, coherent narrative? The hypothesis is this: the civilizing heroes were not gods. They were not supernatural beings. They were people. They were the human survivors of a sophisticated, high-tech global maritime civilization that was all but wiped out during the catastrophic climate shift of the Younger Dryas. This single idea reframes the entire picture. The figures we remember as Thoth, Quetzalcoatl, or Oans were not divine entities descending from the heavens. They were more like missionaries from a lost world, perhaps scientists, engineers, and teachers. Their magic was simply the preserved knowledge of their former civilization. In a world thrown back into a primitive state, a simple understanding of agriculture, astronomy, or architecture would seem miraculous. A lighter that creates fire on demand is magic to someone who has only ever known friction. Imagine their task. A small number of survivors, scattered across the globe, in possession of the inherited knowledge of their entire culture. They find the other remnants of humanity, traumatized hunter-gatherer bands struggling to survive in a hostile new world. Their mission, then, was not one of conquest or rule. It was a mission of preservation, an attempt to reboot the civilizing process by disseminating the most critical information, the civilization survival kit, before it was lost forever. This perspective is important because it grounds the hypothesis in human terms. These survivors were not omnipotent. The evidence suggests they were working with limited resources, against overwhelming odds, and facing the slow erosion of their own knowledge over generations. This could explain why the knowledge they passed on seems fragmented, why we find brilliant flashes of astronomical genius next to what appears to be simple Bronze Age culture. It was an imperfect transfer, a desperate act of cultural salvage. And if we accept this, even as a thought experiment, it forces us to look again at the great stone monuments we began with. If they weren't built by primitive farmers or dynastic kings alone, and if they were influenced by the survivors of a lost civilization, then what was their true purpose? Were they merely tombs and temples? Or were they something more, machines, archives, or warnings, designed to endure the long night of a planetary amnesia? This working hypothesis, that the civilizing heroes of myth were the human survivors of a lost civilization, is a powerful narrative. But a good narrative is not enough. For it to be a useful investigative tool, it must do more than just tell a story. It must provide a more coherent explanation for the physical evidence than the models we currently have. It must be able to resolve the paradoxes we have already encountered. Let us apply this lens to Göbekli Tepe. The central enigma of the site has always been its timing, a massive, astronomically aligned complex built by supposed hunter-gatherers 6,000 years before Stonehenge. It appears suddenly, with no clear precedent, just as the Younger Dryas catastrophe is ending. But under the survivor hypothesis, the builders were not primitive. They were the inheritors of a world of knowledge, desperately trying to reboot civilization. In this light, Göbekli Tepe is no longer a premature temple. It becomes a functional installation, a recovery center. Its astronomical alignments, perhaps including the vulture stone, were not for worship but for observation, a necessary effort to remap the stars after a cataclysm that may have shifted the very ground beneath their feet. Its purpose was to re-establish the celestial clock, the foundation of any sophisticated calendar, and the key to restarting agriculture. This reframing changes the site's function from a ritualistic space to a practical one. It provides a logical reason for why such an advanced project would be undertaken at that exact moment in history, not as the dawn of a new idea, but as the desperate first-light effort to salvage an old one. The knowledge wasn't being born, it was being preserved. If we follow this logic, the Great Pyramid of Giza also transforms. The obsession with its engineering precision, its near-perfect alignment to true north, its complex geometry, its sheer permanence, begins to look less like an expression of pharaonic power and more like a set of design specifications. If your goal is to build a tomb, Such precision is impressive but ultimately symbolic. But if your goal is to build a time capsule, an indestructible archive designed to survive geological time and transmit a message to the far future, then permanence and precision become the entire point. Under this hypothesis, the Great Pyramid is not just a tomb, it is a library built of stone, a silent repository for the most crucial elements of the civilization survival kit, the principles of mathematics, the measure of the Earth, and the mechanics of the solar system, all encoded in its dimensions and alignments. It was designed to endure, a message in a bottle for a species with amnesia, ensuring that the core knowledge would not be lost in the next cycle. It was a failsafe against planetary forgetting. The evidence we've examined so far is monumental, literally carved into the planet's surface. It speaks of a mastery over stone and stars, but not all messages from the deep past are so permanent. Some are far more fragile. They are drawn on parchment, passed down from hand to hand across generations, surviving only by chance. And sometimes, one of these fragile documents contains a piece of information so out of place, it threatens to rewrite the map of history itself. In the year 1929, while cataloguing items in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a discovery was made. It was a fragment of a world map drawn on gazelle skin. The document was dated precisely. According to the inscription, it was completed in the month of Muharram in the Islamic year 919, which corresponds to the year 1513 in the Western calendar. The cartographer was an admiral of the Ottoman fleet, a well-documented historical figure named Piri Reis. This is the calm, verifiable surface of the story. Piri Reis was a known explorer and mapmaker, and his work was a composite, a synthesis of the best available knowledge of his time. He even noted directly on the map that he had compiled it from about 20 different source charts. Some of these sources, he wrote, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, and others were based on even older originals. The map shows the coasts of Western Europe, North Africa, and Brazil with reasonable accuracy for the period. For decades, it was regarded as a fascinating but understandable historical artifact. The anomaly is not in what the map gets right, but in what it appears to show that should be impossible. As the coastline of South America extends southward, it begins to curve to the east. And here, in the bottom right corner of the fragment, is a stretch of land that has become the subject of decades of intense controversy. According to one detailed analysis, this landmass is a depiction of the northern coast of Antarctica, specifically Queen Maud Land, but it is depicted without its ice cap. Let's be precise here. This is not a settled fact, but a powerful and unsettling interpretation. The issue is this: Antarctica was not officially discovered until the year 1820. Its subglacial coastline, the actual land hidden beneath miles of ice, was not mapped until the advent of seismic sounding technology in the mid-20th century. Yet, here on a map from 1513, compiled from sources Piri Reis claimed were ancient, is a coastline that seems to match the land beneath the ice. The map appears to contain information that no one in the 16th century could have possessed. And if the information came from his ancient sources, then the timeline of exploration is thrown into chaos. The Piri Reis map confronts us with a fundamental problem. It's not just a drawing, it's a claim about the physical state of the world at a time when, according to our models, it should have been impossible. An ice-free coast of Antarctica, mapped with apparent accuracy, requires a world that is radically different from the one our geological timeline describes. So, how could such a world have existed? What physical mechanism could account for such a drastic change? This question brings us to the work of an American academic, a history professor named Charles Hapgood. In the 1950s, while studying ancient maps, Hapgood came to believe they pointed towards a forgotten episode of global exploration. But he understood that for this to be possible, the world itself must have been physically different. He proposed a controversial geological hypothesis to explain it, detailed in his 1958 book, quote, 9. The theory is known as Earth crust displacement. To be clear, this is not the same as continental drift. Continental drift is the slow, grinding movement of tectonic plates over millions of years at a rate of a few centimeters per year. What Hapgood proposed was something far more sudden and catastrophic. In his model, the Earth's entire outer crust, the lithosphere, is seen as a single, rigid shell floating on the molten layer beneath it, the asthenosphere. Hapgood hypothesized that under certain stresses, This entire crust could shift or slip over the interior of the planet all at once. In simple terms, imagine the loose peel of an orange slipping over the fruit inside. The continents would remain fixed relative to each other, but the entire landmass would move into different latitudes, and therefore different climates, in a geological instant. This is by any measure an extraordinary claim. It sits far outside the mainstream of accepted geology, and yet, Hapgood's work attracted the attention of one of the 20th century's greatest scientific minds. The foreword to his 1958 book was written by Albert Einstein. Einstein noted that he was frequently sent ideas from outside the scientific mainstream, and that most were of little value. Hapgood's work, however, was different. Now let's be very precise here. Einstein did not endorse the theory as proven fact. What he did was endorse the investigation. He wrote, quote, "His idea is original, of great simplicity, and, if it continues to prove itself, of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth's surface." Einstein saw a legitimate scientific question being asked with diligence and intellectual honesty. He found the possibility intriguing enough to lend his name to its introduction, suggesting it deserved serious consideration, not dismissal. The theory of Earth crust displacement, while not accepted by orthodox geology, offers a single, coherent mechanism for many of the anomalies we're investigating. It provides a way for a continent like Antarctica to have been in a temperate climate thousands of years ago, and then to have been violently shifted to the South Pole. It also provides a trigger for the kind of global catastrophe described in the Younger Dryas data, and preserved in the world's flood myths. It is a radical idea, but one that attempts to connect the dots rather than leaving them as isolated mysteries. If the Piri Reis map were a singular isolated artifact, it could perhaps be filed away as a historical curiosity, a fluke, a cartographic ghost that defies easy explanation. But it is not alone. Once we start looking, we find that it is not an anomaly, but the first piece of a much larger and more disturbing pattern. It is a key that unlocks a whole library of impossible knowledge from our past. Consider the world map created in the year 1531 by the French cartographer Orontius Phineas. This map, now housed in the Library of Congress, presents another stunning chronological paradox. At the bottom of the world, it depicts a vast southern continent, roughly where Antarctica lies. But this is not the continent we know today. The map shows an Antarctica largely free of its central ice cap. It depicts detailed coastlines, mountain ranges in the interior, and even rivers flowing from those mountains down to the sea. I will say this again. This map was drawn nearly 300 years before Antarctica was even officially discovered in 1820. Now, to be fair, and this is an important check, the Orontius Phineas map is not a perfect photograph. The overall shape of the continent is distorted when compared to modern seismic surveys. The coastlines are approximate, and like many maps of its era, it is populated with the assumptions and errors of 16th century geography. But that is precisely what makes its core accuracy so jarring. The map gets many things wrong, but it seems to get one monumental thing right: the presence of subglacial topography, the shape of the land beneath the ice, which we ourselves only mapped with advanced technology in the 20th century. The question is not whether the map is perfect, but how it could contain any of this information at all, and the pattern continues. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator, perhaps the most respected and influential cartographer in history, published his own world map. It too shows a continent at the South Pole, complete with details that suggest an ice-free landmass. Mercator, like Phineas and Piri Reis before him, was not an explorer of these regions. He was a scholar, a compiler, working in a European library. So where did this information come from? The cartographers themselves provide the answer. Many of them, including Mercator, wrote directly on their maps that they were compiling them from numerous much more ancient source maps. Sources that were available to them in the great libraries of Europe, many of which were themselves copies of even older documents rescued from places like the Imperial Library of Constantinople, or even, according to some traditions, the Great Library of Alexandria. What emerges is not a picture of 16th century invention, but one of 16th century preservation. These men were not drawing a world they imagined. It seems they were dutifully, and perhaps without fully understanding it, copying a world that someone else had seen and mapped long, long before. We have now followed a trail of cartographic ghosts, the Piri Reis map with its fragment of an ice-free Antarctic coast, the Orontius map showing the entire continent's subglacial topography, the charts of Gerardus Mercator, which he openly admitted were based on far older sources. This is not a series of isolated errors or lucky guesses, it is a consistent pattern. We are looking at the echoes of a lost tradition of global map-making, one that possessed geographical knowledge that should not have existed for thousands of years. So let us assemble these pieces and ask the most fundamental question. What does it actually take to produce a map of a continent, let alone the world? It requires more than just ships. It requires a specific, non-negotiable set of scientific tools. To accurately map any landmass, you need to determine the precise latitude and longitude of countless points along its coast. Latitude, your position north or south, is relatively simple to find. You can calculate it from the position of the sun or stars. But longitude, your position east or west, is a notoriously difficult problem. In simple terms, to find your longitude on a featureless ocean, you need to know two times simultaneously: the local time where you are and the time at a fixed reference point, like your home port. The difference between these two times tells you how far east or west you have travelled. This requires a clock of extraordinary accuracy and resilience, one that can keep perfect time for months on end despite the violent motion of a ship at sea. Such a device, the marine chronometer, was considered one of the great technological achievements of its era. According to our history books, it was invented in the mid-18th century, and here the entire edifice of our established timeline begins to fracture. The ancient source maps, which Piri Reis and others copied, display a knowledge of accurate relative longitudes. This implies that their creators, thousands of years before the 18th century, had solved the problem. They must have possessed a method for determining longitude with a high degree of precision. Whether it was a mechanical chronometer or some other forgotten technique, the result is the same. It demonstrates a level of scientific sophistication far beyond anything credited to the ancient world. We are therefore forced to envision a civilization with a complete toolkit of advanced geodesy. They would have needed a deep understanding of spherical trigonometry to project the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat map. They would have required a global network of explorers systematically gathering data over long voyages, and they would have needed a central institution capable of collating this data, correcting it, and compiling it into a world atlas. The very same atlas whose tattered fragments would eventually find their way to the libraries of Constantinople and Alexandria, and from there onto the desks of Renaissance mapmakers. This was not the work of a few lucky sailors. It was the product of an organized, scientific and global maritime civilization, the same civilization whose architectural fingerprint we found at Giza, Puma Punku and Baalbek, the one whose memory is preserved in the worldwide myths of a great flood and the civilizing heroes who came after. Up to this point, our investigation has been grounded in the physical world, in stone, in ice cores, and in the faint, durable lines of ancient maps. We have followed a trail that suggests a lost global civilization, erased by a cataclysm at the end of the last ice age. But assembling this evidence forces us to confront a much deeper question. It is a question not about geology or archaeology, but about the very shape of time itself. Our modern world is built, almost without exception, on a single, unstated belief about history, that it is a straight line, a linear progression. We see time as a road that starts somewhere in a primitive, simple past and stretches forward into an ever more complex, technologically advanced future. Each step is new, each achievement is a first. In this model, we are the pinnacle of the story so far. It is an arrow, shot once, flying forward. This idea feels so natural, so self-evident, that we rarely even notice it is an idea at all. But for the vast majority of human history, people saw time in a completely different way. For most ancient cultures, history was not a line, it was a wheel, a great repeating cycle. They believed that civilizations, like the seasons, were born, they matured, they decayed, and they died, only to be reborn again after a period of cataclysm and forgetting. Let us be clear about what this difference means. A linear model of history implies that our story is unique. It happens only once. A cyclical model, however, suggests that we are merely one iteration, one turn of the wheel. It implies that great civilizations have risen before us and have fallen before us, and that our own world is not the end of the story, but just one more chapter in a book that repeats itself. Imagine, for instance, the cosmology of ancient India. Here, time is measured in vast cycles called yugas. These are immense ages, lasting hundreds of thousands of years, that describe a slow descent from a golden age of enlightenment, the Satya Yuga, down through ages of silver and bronze, to our current age of conflict and darkness, the Kali Yuga. At the end of this cycle, the universe is dissolved and then recreated, and the great wheel begins to turn once more. This was not an isolated belief. The same fundamental idea appears in ancient Greece. The philosopher Plato wrote of a, quote, 11, a vast period of time, estimates range from 25,000 to 36,000 years, after which the sun, moon and planets all return to their original starting positions. This celestial alignment, he believed, triggered immense terrestrial catastrophes, floods and fires, which wiped the slate of civilization clean, leaving only a few survivors to begin the story anew. Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya also structured their calendars around immense cycles of creation and destruction. The world they inhabited was not the first world, but the fourth or fifth. We have always treated these concepts as elegant metaphors, as philosophical or religious allegories for spiritual life, for the seasons, for the rise and fall of empires. But what if we've been missing the point? In the context of the evidence we've examined of a global cataclysm, of lost knowledge, of a human story far older than we admit, we are forced to ask a new and, frankly, unsettling question. What if the ancients were not speaking in metaphors? What if they were describing a mechanism? What if they were simply telling us how the world actually works? The ancient world's embrace of cyclical time is not just a philosophical curiosity. It is a direct challenge to our own story, our own sense of permanence. It forces us to turn the lens of this entire investigation around, away from the deep past and squarely onto the present. It asks us to perform a thought experiment that is both simple and deeply sobering. Imagine for a moment that our global civilization were to end tomorrow, not in a single, fiery apocalypse, but in a quiet, sudden vanishing. The power grids fail, the servers go dark, the maintenance stops. The question is not what happens in a year or a decade. The question is, what remains after 12,000 years, the same span of time that separates us from the builders of Göbekli Tepe? Our first instinct is to think of our cities, the colossal skeletons of skyscrapers, the sprawling networks of roads. But our structures are not built like the pyramids or the walls of Baalbek. They are built of steel and concrete. Steel rusts. In a few centuries, the rebar inside our concrete would expand and crack it to pieces. According to a study in the Journal of the American Concrete Institute, unprotected modern concrete structures in many environments might only last 100 to 200 years before becoming structurally unsound. Our glass towers would shatter. Our bridges would collapse. After a few millennia, our great metropolises would be little more than strange, geometrically patterned hills covered by forest and soil. This is a calm, analytical assessment of material decay. What would remain are the things we built with the same logic as the ancients, massive earthworks and structures of solid stone. The Hoover Dam might survive. Mount Rushmore would still be recognizable, its features softened by erosion. But the intricate, complex and defining features of our world would be gone. But the true fragility of our civilization is not in its structures, it is in its knowledge. The entirety of our art, our science, our history, our literature, our collective memory, is stored as an electrical or magnetic charge on a fragile substrate. It exists on hard drives, on servers, in the cloud. This format is incredibly efficient, but it is also terrifyingly ephemeral. Without a constant supply of electricity and a civilization to maintain the hardware, our digital archive would decay not over millennia, but over decades. According to the US National Archives and Records Administration, the lifespan of a modern hard drive is estimated to be as little as 5 years, and magnetic tapes, a longer-term storage solution, might last 30. In a single century, nearly all of it would be gone, scrambled into meaningless noise. So what would a future intelligence find? After 12,000 years of silence, they would find no libraries, no databases, no record of Shakespeare or Einstein or the moon landing. They would find the enigmatic bulk of our dams, the strange faces carved into a mountain, and perhaps the faint chemical traces of our plastics in the sediment. They would look at the ruins of our civilization the same way we look at the ruins of Puma Punku, with a profound sense of mystery. They would wonder what kind of people built these things, and what happened to them. They would have no answers, only megaliths and myths. The reflection on our own civilizational fragility forces a final, and perhaps the most profound, shift in this investigation. We have been searching for a memory of the past in external things, in stone, in myth, in maps. We have treated history as an archive, something to be read outside of ourselves. But this assumes that memory is only ever stored on a physical medium. What if the most durable archive is not made of stone or parchment, but of consciousness itself? This brings us to one of the oldest and most persistent ideas in human thought. The ancient Greek philosophers, particularly Plato, gave it a name: anamnesis. In simple terms, anamnesis is the idea that learning is not the acquisition of new information, but the act of remembering what the soul already knew before it was born into a physical body. It suggests that deep within us lies a reservoir of innate knowledge, a memory of a more perfect, complete state of understanding. To be clear, this is not a scientific theory in the modern sense. It is a philosophical framework, a way of accounting for the strange fact that certain truths feel less like discoveries and more like recognitions. It speaks to a level of knowing that seems to pre-exist our individual lives. It is an elegant, if unprovable, attempt to explain the origin of intuition, of genius, and of those universal ideas that seem to surface in every culture, in every age, without any apparent contact. In the 20th century, this ancient concept found a new language in the work of the psychologist Carl Jung. He proposed the existence of a collective unconscious, a layer of the human psyche shared by all people, across all time. This unconscious, according to Jung's model, is not empty. It is structured by what he called archetypes. What this means is that we are born with certain inherited patterns of thought, imagery and instinct, the figure of the wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the shadow, and critically, the archetype of the apocalypse and the flood. If we apply this lens to the evidence we have gathered, the entire picture shifts. The flood myths are no longer just historical accounts, distorted by millennia of oral tradition. They become something deeper, the surfacing of a powerful archetype, a deep memory of catastrophe encoded not in a story, but in the very structure of our collective psyche. The civilizing heroes like Owans or Quetzalcoatl cease to be just historical figures and become expressions of the wise guide archetype, emerging precisely when humanity is most in need of recovery. From this perspective, the story is no longer about a lost civilization of which we are not a part. It is about a lost part of ourselves. The feeling of a forgotten golden age, the sense that we are living among the ruins of something greater. These are not just poetic fancies. They are the echoes of anamnesis. They are the psychic scars of a species that has been through a profound trauma and has spent the last 12,000 years trying, unconsciously, to remember what it lost. The investigation then turns inward. It becomes a search not for lost cities, but for a lost state of being. Before we allow ourselves to be carried too far on these deep currents of memory and myth, it is essential to pause. An investigation like this, if it is to be honest, must also be self-critical. It requires us to stop, take a deliberate step back, and apply the strongest possible dose of skepticism to the entire narrative we have constructed. It is time to present the counter-argument, not as a caricature, but in its most robust and reasonable form. To be fair, the mainstream scientific consensus is not built on dogmatic refusal to see the evidence. It is built on a principle of methodological caution, the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and that simpler, localized explanations are usually preferable to a single, grand, all-encompassing theory. From this perspective, the anomalies we have examined are not the scattered pieces of one lost civilization, but a collection of separate, unrelated puzzles, each with its own proposed solution. For Göbekli Tepe, the standard archaeological view is not that its builders were given knowledge, but that hunter-gatherers themselves were simply far more socially and ideologically complex than previously assumed. It adjusts our understanding of the Neolithic period. It does not demand a lost golden age. For the Great Sphinx, The majority of geologists argue that the deep weathering is not from ancient rainfall, but from a combination of factors, including the poor quality of the limestone in the enclosure and the corrosive effects of desert moisture and salt crystallization over millennia. The argument is that these are terrestrial understandable processes, not proof of a different climate. The Orion correlation theory, while poetically compelling, is considered by the overwhelming majority of astronomers and Egyptologists to be a form of pattern matching, a case of finding a celestial map in the sands because one is determined to look for it. And the Piri Reis map, according to most cartographic historians, is a brilliant but flawed composite of its time, likely depicting a speculative southern landmass common in that era's cartography, not a survey of an ice-free Antarctica. In simple terms, where this investigation proposes a single unifying cause, a lost predecessor civilization, the consensus model offers a series of separate, non-catastrophic solutions. It argues there is no need to invent a ghost to explain these phenomena because each can be addressed within our current historical framework, even if some of the details remain debated. Therefore, it is crucial to state this clearly. The narrative of a global culture erased by the Younger Dryas remains a speculative hypothesis. It is a compelling model for connecting the dots, but it is not, by the standards of mainstream science, an established fact. After acknowledging the weight of doubt and the strength of the conventional timeline, where does this investigation leave us? It leaves us not with a finished theory, but with a persistent echo, a pattern of anomalies that, when viewed in isolation, are easily dismissed as paradoxes or errors in dating. But when seen together, they begin to resonate with one another, suggesting a single, coherent, and profoundly uncomfortable story. Our journey began with stones that should not exist at Göbekli Tepe. It led us to the rain-worn enclosure of the Great Sphinx, then deep beneath the waves to the silent corners of Yonaguni. We found a planetary scar left by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, a wound that corresponds in time with the oldest human myths of a world drowned by a great flood. We traced a fingerprint of advanced knowledge in the celestial alignments of Giza, the impossible engineering of Puma Punku, and the titanic foundations of Baalbek. Finally, we unrolled ancient maps that seem to show a world that has not existed for more than 12,000 years. What emerges from this synthesis is not a proof, but a powerful and haunting possibility. It is the portrait of a species with amnesia, a species that has perhaps more than once climbed to great heights of knowledge and achievement, only to be thrown down by cosmic and terrestrial cataclysms, losing almost everything in the process. We are left with only the faintest, most durable fragments of memory, fragments that become the foundation for our myths, our religions, and our deepest unexamined fears. This framework changes the very meaning of our history. It suggests that our task is not simply a linear march forward into the future, a constant invention of the new. It may also be an act of profound remembering, a careful and patient recovery of what was lost. In this view, the clues are not just curiosities, they are parts of a vast, scattered inheritance, waiting for a generation with the tools and the courage to piece them back together. To be a species with amnesia is to live with a constant nagging sense that the story we tell ourselves is incomplete. It is to feel a strange resonance with the great myths, to see in the ruins of the deep past not the work of primitive ancestors, but the echoes of a forgotten version of ourselves. It instills a sense of humility, a recognition that our own towering civilization, with its digital archives and steel monuments, is likely just as fragile as any that may have come before. Therefore, this investigation does not end with an answer. It ends with a reframing of the question. The ultimate mystery is not whether an advanced civilization existed in the deep past. The mystery is the nature of human memory itself, its incredible resilience, and its terrifying fragility. The work, then, is not to replace one history book with another, but to learn how to listen to the stones, to the myths, and to the faint, persistent whisper of a story that has been waiting, for a very long time, to be remembered. And so our investigation does not end with a final answer, written in the clear language of certainty. It concludes here, on the quiet shore of a great and humbling mystery. The evidence, the patterns, the echoes, they do not provide a map to a lost world. They are merely the faint lights of a distant coastline, seen for a moment through a lifting fog, the stones of Göbekli Tepe, buried by their own creators, the weathered face of the Sphinx staring into an age of rain that history has forgotten, the precise and silent H-blocks of Puma Punku. These are not just artifacts, they are whispers. They suggest that we are not the first, that the story of humanity might be a story of great waves that rise and fall, leaving behind on the shores of time only the heaviest, most durable fragments of what came before. Perhaps the Earth itself is the only true historian. Its memory is long written in layers of ice and rock, in the slow drift of continents, and in the silent depths of its oceans. Our own chronicles, stored on fragile paper and flickering screens, are but a single sentence in a library of immense and patient time. We search for our past in our own records, forgetting that we are living inside the archive itself. What other forgotten chapters lie waiting, not in our books, but under the crushing weight of the ice at the poles, or in the silent, unexplored darkness of the deep ocean floor? What other structures, what other memories, are preserved down there, waiting for the day when the great wheel turns, the waters recede, and the story of another humanity is revealed? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is not what we have forgotten, but what the Earth is waiting to remember.